I want to make sure we start hooked on time, right? Because we have so much to talk about today. Thank you for coming. It's my job to welcome you and transition to the panel. My name is Shannon Raisler. I'm a faculty member here at the law school and faculty director of the Hubble Environmental Law Initiative. We're delighted that you're joining us today, either in person or online. We hope that you will visit our website and attend events in the future. And I see some people have been to our previous events and some newcomers. So it's really wonderful to grow this community. I'm just curious because I'm not teaching in the first year curriculum this year. How many one-notes are in the room? Excellent. Well, that's great. So you would be unfamiliar faces to many of you. So I hope to have a chance to meet you in the very near future. This event is made possible by Charlotte and Fred Hubble, whose generosity funds the Hubble Environmental Law Initiative here at Iowa Law. Because of their support, we've been able to enrich the student experience around environmental, natural resources, and energy law, and engage both our community and the wider community in discussions on topics ranging from solar energy, climate adaptation, biodiversity, and more. We are delighted that today we have an opportunity to focus especially on what a commitment to biodiversity means in an agricultural state. Before I transition to the panel, I want to thank our program director. Every time I do this, is not she's probably outside and still taking care of details. Great group. We are so thankful for all of the. She takes. She's amazing. She makes things happen. Our new beautiful banners, for example. Just we're in our applause. We're so super excited. So thank you, Blake, for all you do. And now, without further ado, I'm going to transition and introduce our research fellow, Ingrid Gronsdorf, who is a panelist and moderator of this event. She will in turn introduce the panel next. So Ingrid is the one that operates Coyote Run Farm with his husband Patrick Stanley in Marion County. He has served in several Iowa leadership positions and manages farmer-led conservation for almost 25 years. So it's a great panel, a lot of expertise on the panel today, and we're excited to share our knowledge with all of you. So this is me. I just wanted to start with a quick introduction to the biodiversity crisis for people who aren't familiar with it. So biodiversity stands for biological diversity. This is the idea of the various different types of species that exist across the globe. And currently we are experiencing a biodiversity crisis. So you can see here, the slide is a little busy, but I pulled a few different reports and things talking about from the UN discussing the biodiversity crisis and talking about, this is very urgent. You see words in here like unprecedented and extinction rates accelerating. So this is quite dire situation. And talking about the current global response is woefully insufficient to address this, and things like transformative change. So it's not that we need to add a little bit more land or we need to do a little bit more. This is something that's urgent and needs a lot of attention in order to address current extinction rates and loss of natural spaces and areas and loss of biodiversity. There's also here the UN noted opposition from vested interests can be overcome and should be overcome for the public good in the area of biodiversity. And this is something we'll talk about
a little bit the challenge of land preservation when you have other interests in those lands that are vested in those lands being productive or used for extractive purposes or other things than habitat conservation. So at the beginning of the Biden-Harris administration, they introduced the 30 by 30 goal, which is protect 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030. And this is a global target, 30% by 2030. This is something the UN has also put in their goals, and over 100 countries at this point have gone to a 30 by 30 goal. So this is something, protect 30% of the earth to protect biodiversity across the globe. And this is sort of an intermediate step on the way to hopefully preserving 50% by 2050. So these are big, not a lot of land when you think about it. So these are big goals, but also from researchers necessary to preserve nature and to halt the extinction crisis we're experiencing. And that crisis can, it's not just that it's nice to have plants and animals around. That's obviously, we like that, but it's also ecosystem services, things like pollinators for agriculture. You have water quality. We rely on Earth's ecosystem services for a lot of the things we do, and when those get disrupted, that can be catastrophic for many different species, including us at the end of the day. So the goal here is to protect biodiversity by protecting habitat. So there are a few things when the Biden administration laid out the plan that I think were confusing to people, or maybe still are areas for discussion. One is that while the goal is to conserve 30% of lands, it didn't define conserve. So what lands do we count as conserved, and recreational ATV trails count as conserved, or things like this that serve a purpose, getting access to the outdoors, but is it actually getting to biodiversity preservation and habitat preservation? So there are questions like that. One other, 30% of lands and waters, but what they mean by waters here is ocean and coastal habitat. So the initiative doesn't address freshwater resources, which obviously is a big part of conservation and a big part of habitat conservation, especially in the Midwest where we don't have ocean resources to speak of. And then the initial focus here has been on federally owned land, as Professor Raisler pointed out, and that makes some sense because those are more easily, they're already under federal government control to a certain extent, and then it's easier to deal with those lands than privately owned lands where you have to gain some sort of protection or access to that land. And this is important to note because it's important to not shy away from areas that might have more conflict, like areas that are owned privately, because even if you preserve all of the West or all of certain areas, that doesn't address all of the biodiversity. That doesn't address species that don't live there, right? So we could conserve a lot of land that doesn't actually address critical species that are endangered or threatened. And this map, I think, is really it's quite striking when you see that in the Corn Belt, you don't really have much permanently protected land, particularly in Iowa here. So this is a pretty stark visual representation of the fact that we just don't have a lot of permanently protected, federally owned land here. So how do we preserve biodiversity in the Midwest when we do have really important species? We have it's a flyway for a lot of migratory birds. The Mississippi River goes through here. We have monarch butterflies going through here, right? There are really critical species that rely on habitat in the Midwest. So how do we approach 30 by 30 here, and how do we leverage that initiative? Another part of 30 by 30, there was a lot of focus in there, acknowledgement that private land needs to be part of the solution, but focusing really on voluntary programs, locally led initiatives, that sort of thing, not introducing any new regulation. And going back to the need for transformative change, you know, how does that really achieve the ideas of transformative change? You know, do we scale up existing programs, or do we need more than that to increase participation? So I'll give a quick introduction to private land conservation, then I'll hand it over to the panelists. But you know, when we talk about preservation, we're talking about, okay, we're going to take a piece of land and really preserve it for habitat. So you can purchase the property outright or purchase a property right like a conservation easement. You can also have conservation practices on your land. So the land is still working land for agriculture or other activities, but you have habitat preservation on that land. And one thing I just wanted to note, me personally, I have some connection to land preservation on working lands. My sister and I, with the help of my dad and his sisters, we actually own 80 acres of farmland in Greene County, close to where we grew up. It was part of this land sale by the Garst family, and the Garst sold all this several parcels of land with conservation easements on them. So we're required to do cover cropping. We're required to work with White Rock Conservancy as the land trust that holds the easement. So we're with them on our planning and various aspects of that. So I'm actually, you know, working with currently my tenant farmers and White Rock and my own land manager and these dynamics between how we actually accomplish conservation on privately owned land. But this was very important to the Garst family to preserve their legacy of conservation on their farmland and sort of set an example for land sales in the future, especially for families that have worked hard to have to preserve their land and have good soil health and have and just make that part of their legacy. We also currently have a small waterway on the property, so we just put a prairie strip in for as part of the CRP program, which we'll talk about later. So it's you know, you have a wide angle into this, and then we've actually been putting that into practice in our own farm. So that's been an interesting journey. But with that said, I will turn it over to the experts.
Good afternoon. Again, my name is Anna Gray. I'm the Public Policy Director and Counsel at Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation. I'm excited to be here today to share some perspective about land trust work and Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation and some of the land protection methods that we use here in Iowa, particularly with private land protection. And then also touch a little bit and tee things up for Kate, the role that law and policy play in enabling those land protection methods. So Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation is one of over 1,200 land trusts across the country. Collectively, land trusts have protected over 61 million acres of land through private conservation easements, fee title ownership, and partnerships with public agencies. And so given this experience, land trusts are well equipped to help step in and take on challenges like tackling climate change, meeting initiatives like 30 by 30. Iowa Natural Heritage Foundation was established in 1979 by Governor Ray and other conservation leaders at the time who saw a need for a private entity who could be more flexible in working with the state to protect lands of special significance. So we are a 501c3 nonprofit. We are supported by over 10,000 private individuals and organizations across the state. And we are an accredited land trust and work with partners all over the country to collaborate and protect land, both agricultural and natural. So I'm going to touch first on the work that we do for public land protection. As I said, we were really created to be a partner to public entities. And so a core function of our work is to serve as an interim landowner
working with private landowners who may want their land to become a park, trail, or wildlife area. But because it takes extensive planning, fundraising, and authorization for public entities to acquire land, landowners often don't want to wait a couple of years to divest of their property. So we were really created to be a flexible organization that can step in, secure that property, and then work with our public partners to transition it into public ownership. And so we help protect over 130,000 acres with this model and 1,000 different projects across the state. But in addition to working with our public partners, INHF also owns land that we have a stewardship team out working either with farm tenants or doing natural restoration on the land. That land comes to us in a various mechanisms and ways. So we may purchase it and be title, where we fundraise and have supporters that recognize that as an important property to protect. We have donors who donate their property in fee title or sell at a reduced price. We also have several donations of preserved life estates, is what we call them, but they're really remainder interest. They're a donation of a remainder interest where that landowner retains a life estate in the property. And then we also have several landowners who have listed INHF as a beneficiary of their will. But by far our most popular private conservation mechanism is a conservation easement. So conservation easement is a private conveyance of property rights to a third party, so often a land trust like INHF. And those conservation easements, each is tailored to that property and the needs and goals of protecting that property. So it could be to preserve natural landscape, it could be to preserve the agricultural value. But some of the typical restrictions include restrictions on development, mining, or severe extraction from that property done without a stewardship or conservation plan. These conservation easements are perpetual. So INHF has vested that property right in perpetuity, and we have a duty and a right to enforce and monitor those conservation easements each year. So we have a team of staff that every single year, we hold over 200 conservation easements, goes out and visits each and every single one of those properties to make sure that that property continues to be protected in the way that is outlined in that conservation easement. Landowners who have donated the conservation easement still hold that underlying fee title and can transfer that to successor landowners as they otherwise wish. So via will, they can sell it, etc. Conservation easements are often donated to INHF, but they can be purchased using federal, or I should say public funds or private funds. And they can also be held by public entities like Natural Resources Conservation Service, for example. Finally, an example just to show how private land protection can really help leverage public land. I've got some maps here. This is a section of the Upper Iowa River in Winneshiek County. So here in green, you can see the public land that is protected. This blue adds on federally held or federally funded conservation easements. And then here, you can see that the corridor is being built out to include privately donated conservation easements held by INHF. And so this is an example of kind of the model that helps protect larger corridors to really leverage and maximize those biodiversity, wildlife habitat, water quality benefits that we're striving for here in Iowa. And then as law students, lawyers, you probably recognize that these protection methods are mechanisms of law and policy. So the very existence of our public partners, their authority to own and protect land, their funding sources are all dependent on state law. INHF's ability to own farmland is an exception in the corporate farming statute in Iowa. Our ability to hold conservation easements in perpetuity is also a function of state law and the state enabling statute for conservation easements. And so the very authority to protect land is a function of law and policy that has been recognized as something that we need to do for public benefit. But in addition to the authorization, they also provide incentives. So those incentives often come in the form of state or federal tax benefits but it can also come in the form of program incentives. So for example, for conservation easements, there are easements funded through the Farm Bill, like the agricultural land easement program, the wetland land easement program. And now I'm going to turn it over to Kate, who's going to talk a little bit more about the Farm Bill and some of the programs that I'm going to do anyone for their private land protection.
Thank you, Anna. I have to say I have two slides that look very similar in here, and one of them I can answer questions on, and one I might send to her. So it feels really good to be in good company on the panel. Again, I'm Kate Hansen with the Center for Rural Affairs. We are a nonprofit, sort of a regional group, and I'm one of our staff here in Iowa. Our goal is to endorse and support vibrant rural communities. And a lot of my time is spent working with farmers and on ag and conservation programs. How can we make them work better and look better on the ground? And in my world, we speak a lot about the carrot and the stick. Maybe you've heard this before, maybe you can visualize. The different levers we can talk about when we're thinking about influencing behavior and people's decision making on our land. The carrot, of course, is referring to incentives. How can we get somebody excited or motivated to make a change? And the stick is, are we talking about regulation or some sort of requirement for that person? When we talk about the carrot, I have to say that's kind of the dominant ecosystem, maybe we can say, in Iowa and federally right now. We have a lot of incentive programs, voluntary opt-in conservation programs where there's typically a cost share involved, some sort of technical assistance as well. And we do have some stick, but again, I think carrot is really the big one that we're looking at today. I want you to visualize something that I've thought about a lot, which is a farmer or landowner walking into their local USDA service center. If they turn maybe right, they're going to go into the Natural Resource Conservation Service, and if they turn left, they're going to go into some math colleague office at the FSA. And if they have conservation on their mind, there are quite a few programs that they might be able to apply for. This list that I'll show you is no way exhaustive. I tried to do something like that, and it was just impossible with the time. But just to give you a sense of some of our heavy hitters. NRCS offers, I believe it was Ingrid that talked a little bit about working lands conservation programs. And the key difference here, the key distinction, is that these are programs that an agricultural producer is going to use on land that is in production. So they're growing a crop, or they're raising livestock, or whatever it may be, and then they're using these programs to integrate new practices and new management that has a conservation benefit. We've got CFP, which is one of our biggest in terms of acres and acres. The 5-year contract where somebody that's already doing conservation can scale up some of their practices with this program. We also have EQIP, which is the largest in terms of active contracts, or I should say new contracts year by year in Iowa. And this is usually a more focused contract that's shorter in length. It's only focused on a single practice or project, but it has similar goals to CSP, getting new conservation, new practices out there on the ground. And there's also the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. This is unique. It runs through partners, and there's a mechanism where a partner organization can serve as a representative for NRCS. Again, trying to get into the good practices on the ground. They might also look into the Conservation Reserve Program. This is a program that runs through FSA, and this is land retirement. We're taking land out of production, out of agricultural production for the conservation benefit for a longer term. So CRP contracts are typically 10 to 15 years. And the benefit that the landowner is going to receive is a payment, because if they're not getting a payment from the tenant, or they're not farming it themselves, this is sort of a way to incentivize putting it into CRP. We also have ASAP, as Anna mentioned, there are federal dollars to get easements on the ground as well. So there's the agricultural arm of ASAP and then the wetland arm. That runs also through NRCS. And how could I forget that farmer might even be pulled in more directions, because in Iowa we also have plenty of local and state level programs. There might be things at the watershed level, at the county level, or even at the state level that may be eligible for. You can imagine that something does get confusing for the producer or the landowner. And I can say, I've spoken with folks in a lot of different states kind of on this topic. And my Iowa deck of available programs is always the longest slide deck, because we do have a lot of opportunities here in Iowa for culture. As I mentioned, there are some sticks on the books. Probably the best example comes from the 1985 Farm Bill, conservation and compliance. And so these are provisions that say a landowner or producer must be doing these things in order to receive federal payments. And we know that a lot of farmers in Iowa are using those payments and depending on those payments like crop insurance, commodity payments, maybe a subsidized loan. So sod buster refers to the fact that they must, if they're working on highly erodible land, an index that's defined, and if they have ground that's AGL ground, then they have to have a conservation plan and a conservation system in place. And swamp buster is designed to protect wetlands. So if you cannot farm on ground that was formerly a wetland, and you can't convert a wetland to farm. Again, this is not exhaustive, it's trying to give you kind of a high level view. So when I think about the work ahead and kind of how we do things at the center, I think there are a couple of tenets that we need to think about with these programs and incentives. The first is that if we start to go to some of these field days or talk with folks that are interested in conservation, they're so enthusiastic, and they're some of my favorite people to work with. But there's also a choir. You start to see the same folks over and over again. And our requirement for that farmer, that landowner that walked into USDA is they have to have conservation on their mind. Because we have a system where you have to opt in. It's voluntary, it's dependent on them caring and wanting to do it. So we have to expand that choir, we have to get more people interested in doing this on their own lands. We also have to improve the programs that we have. My higher rep always says it's a lot easier to improve a program than to create a whole new one. And especially in a really complicated congressional environment, I think that's true. So we have to improve the ones that we have. How can we make them work better? And we also have to defend them in some cases. CFP was the first program we talked about for working lands. And in the 2018 Farm Bill, it was on the chopping block. It was possible that we were going to use directly. We also had some defending to do with different measures. And finally, we have a program, we have a problem with some of these programs where there's too much interest and not enough funding. And we colloquially call this underfunded and oversubscribed. So this is the most frustrating thing to me, because if you have a landowner that wants to come in, they get through this really long application process, and then we don't have the money to fund them. It's just so frustrating, right? We need to nurture that, we need to excite those folks. And so there are a few things on the horizon with some funding from the Inflation Reduction Act. They're exciting, as sort of a bright spot in these discussions, but right now they're not permanent. So we need to address this problem so we can keep fostering that interest and keep these practices going. So with that, I will hand it over to Matt.
Ingrid, Kate, and Anna on it. Thank you very much. It's great to be on a panel with all of you. A couple of things to start with, and we have 600 employees at Iowa Farm Service Agency. We're in 97 different county service centers.
Everybody know that it's the national park.
Oh, okay. Those watching online, this test, we're not going anywhere.
Yeah, I should have thought.
Wow. It works. The one that's coming through on all of our cell phones.
Yes.
I heard that on the radio. All right, ready to go.
I think if you silence your phone, it doesn't work.
I've been in meetings where I'm talking and people wish that they had it. We're ready to go. All right. So I lead the Farm Service Agency, which in Iowa is 97 county offices. We have a few counties that share that service center, Natural Resources Conservation Service, and 100 county offices for the Colorado split east and west. And then rural development is also in 10 of those communities. And we have 600 people that work at FSA, and I always start with this, at least I have been, and hopefully going forward, we'll continue to be able to hire people to serve in these agricultural leadership positions, but we're hiring. So if you know people that want to work as agricultural leaders with USDA, directly serving farmers, please let them know, and you can look on our website, you can get my email, reach out to me. However, just know that we're going to be hiring into the future, as long as we're able to do that. We have the resources to be able to fill these positions. And when I meet with our county offices, and I've been on since November 2021, and this summer I was able to hit the 97th office and sit down and talk with our staff, and I like to talk to them about, I don't know what the top 10 for sure, what the top 10 biggest challenges the world's facing. I don't know what those top 10 are, but I'm pretty confident that I know 5 of them. And that's, how are we going to feed people? How are we going to provide clean energy? How are we going to grow the inputs for products? So if you think about cement, you think about all plastic, all the kinds of things that we're really kind of mining to produce, we're going to be growing those inputs. So cycling carbon through what we're growing to produce, fiber and building materials and all those kinds of things. It's a big challenge. Migration, right? So as people move around the planet, how do we adjust so that people are moving to where they need to be, right? Which is politically very challenging. And I'll say this in a second why Iowa is so important there. But then the last thing of those 5 is ecosystem services. So how are we going to take our agricultural systems and our forestry systems and other kind of natural systems of productivity and evolve them in a way, develop them in a way that we're not just putting conservation over here and production over here, that we're integrating those so that as we farm, we're actually increasing biological, natural, environmental benefits. So all of those things in the next 20 years, 30 years are going to be absolutely critical that the world figures out how to do. And I argue that there's no better place on the planet to help solve all 5 of those problems than for us who happen to either reside or live permanently in Iowa. And historically, we have been developing that. I'll start with migration. We are a state of people who came to this state to be part of the evolving agricultural revolutions that have happened in the last 250, 300 years. So, that is who we are in our DNA. And when we look at things that are happening, the opportunity is there for us to integrate, welcome new people to the state to help us evolve with our agricultural production. And then obviously clean energy, solar, wind, biofuels. I mean, we know how to do this stuff, and farmers have led a lot of this, including wind energy. People forget that it was farmers who were on the leading edge of our renewable. I'm going to get it wrong, but it was the requirement that we had. Not a requirement, but we had the production thing.
Renewable electricity standard.
Thank you. Renewable electricity standard for the wind. That we were one of the first states in the country to do that, and there's a through line to why we have so many wind generators in the state, to that effort that farmers started, and biofuels as well, where farmers themselves were taking the risk and investing back in the 80s. So and ecosystem service, I'll talk about it in just a second, but the most important thing, why that's so important in Iowa, is because we have the land. And I would also talk about the animals and stuff, but it's the productive capacity, right? The land, the ability to produce in this state. The climate, which is weather, rain, all that stuff, really important for production. But I would also argue the most important thing is people. We still have a vast number of lots of small landholders, lots of smaller farms. Then we have an agri-industry, we have research, the whole thing, right? So we have all of this that are people, we have our ag leaders in our county offices. So huge opportunity, we put all that together. So I'm really excited to be part of the Biden-Harris administration. The opportunity to help advance the goals and the vision of this administration. It's a real honor, and it's a tremendous opportunity to be able to work with farmers, to work with our staff, to work across our agency with rural development and RTF. Huge opportunity. And I want to just put a little context around America the Beautiful and the 30 by 30. Because this administration laid out, I think, first point, inauguration following day, I think it was the first executive order was on climate change, right? So they put a marker in the sand. This is really important, and we're going to take an all government approach to advancing this vision. And then I don't know, 4 or 5 months later, they issued the report, which was America the Beautiful, and they coined the 30 by 30, which was the goal that by the year 2030, 30% of the land mass in the United States would be protected, conserved, for all of this tied to climate change, tied to what you all talked about, biodiversity, all that stuff. So I don't know if you remember when that happened, but very quickly, I would say immediately, very loud, very coordinated, and well-resourced, there was a big pushback. Okay, right? So it was not a policy, it was a vision. And it was an all of government, it was a voluntary, and it was a public-private partnership vision. You haven't heard a lot about it since, because the pushback was so strong. And I would just say, we're doing it, right? We're not branding it necessarily that way, but we're moving on a lot of this in the sense of the programs that Anna and Kate talked about, as well as integrated. So we're moving forward on that. And really what it is, and I say this when I meet with our county staff, I say, look, I'm not a fan of big government, I'm not a fan of small government. I'm a fan of smart government. And the work that you all do, delivering what the American public wants, is the investments in farmers, is smart government, right? And you're holding people accountable. If they take the money, they have to do certain things. And you're making sure that everybody has access to these programs. Because if we don't have that kind of level of service, we can crank these programs out so that it's only a certain kind of farmer that gets the programs. And if you know how to game the system, you don't necessarily have to be very accountable. So what we're doing is smart government, and we have a lot more work to do. I'll go ahead and finish up with that so that we can have a discussion and questions. But we are on the cusp of agricultural revolution that is probably bigger and more important than the green revolution. So if you think about 2030 to 2050, that 20-year period was the big revolution, right? I mean, it was fast, it was big, it was technology, it was the introduction of petrochemicals, fossil fuels, from horses to tractors, from biological systems to chemical, and we ramped up productivity, but there was the cost effect. Well, the next 20 years, so 2020 to 2040, 2050, next 20 to 30 years, we're going to have to do something equally as revolutionary. And that's shifting from forcing nature to do what we wanted to do, like we did with the fossil fuel era, to partnering with nature to deliver what we need. And, ecosystem services, environmental benefits, as well as jobs and opportunities for a global community. That's the challenge. I'm optimistic we're going to get there. And I'm really excited to be working with a whole bunch of folks here in the state and across the country who are dedicated to seeing how to make that happen.
Thank you to everyone for your remarks, and we'll switch to the panel. one nice problem to having a full house. We didn't have enough chairs, so we got to our chair cut here for the panel part. But thank you all for your remarks. I think that was a great introduction to what we're discussing today. And one of the first things I wanted to talk about, we just had a lot of discussions about budgets and programming in Congress, and we talked a lot about the Farm Bill. But I wonder if y'all can talk a little bit about what's going on with the current Farm Bill in Congress and how that might impact conservation programs associated with the Farm Bill.
Well, at USDA, there's only one person with an opinion on the Farm Bill, and that's Secretary Vilsack. But without getting out of my lane, just a little explanation is that, you know, the 2018 Farm Bill has expired. Congress did not extend it, but we're in this window of time where we can continue to operate. We get to the end of the calendar year, it gets more challenging, and some really draconian things start to kick in. So that's kind of the catalyst to make sure that lawmakers get busy and get it done, or extend it, or actually officially extend it for a longer time. The one thing I'll comment on is, if you'd have asked anybody that works in agriculture 6 years ago, if they thought, under what circumstances could we invest as much, if not more money into agriculture outside of the Farm Bill as we're doing inside the Farm Bill, to a person, everyone would say, I don't think that's possible. Except we've just done it, right? So we had trade disruptions, creative use of the CCC from the previous administration. Then we had COVID, $4 trillion of investment in agriculture being part of that, all kinds of ad hoc programs. And then lots of weather disruptions, so lots of emergency programs. I don't know what the dollar amount is. If you look at what was inside the Farm Bill and delivered over the last 6 years, or since 2018, and things that have been outside the Farm Bill, it's similar, and that's just unheard of. So, and literally unthinkable. Like, nobody I've ever worked with would have said that's possible. Everybody always says you can't do that. Yes, you can't open the Farm Bill, you can't do that. So that's the big question, I think, going forward, is what's the next Farm Bill going to look like? I know they're working on it, but are we going to continue to be able to do things outside of the Farm Bill and inside of the Farm Bill, or are we going to marry those two things back together? And that's a huge question that I think is open to figuring out. But conservation, ecosystem services, you know, partnership for climate smart commodities, that's part of that creativity outside the Farm Bill. All of that has really blown things open, which can be challenging, but I think it's also a huge opportunity.
Thank you, Matt. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, it's such a big question, Ingrid. Just in the past week, we've avoided the government shutdown. We had our permit expired. We lost our Speaker of the House, and Diane Feinstein sadly passed away. So the timeline, just the whole trajectory here is so up in the air. And if somebody tells you they know what's happening, even if it's a leader of an ag committee, they probably don't. We're figuring it out as we go. I think part of kind of what Matt is getting towards is there's funding kind of discussions happening now of do we marry those brush dollars. In my world, we're focusing a lot on the Inflation Reduction Act, of course, which was nearly $20 million put into conservation programs. And we know that this is going to be a no new money Farm Bill. And so that becomes kind of a thread to pull or something to use for folks that want dollars for other things. And we think it could be pretty politically vulnerable. So that could be something like pulling it into programs that are not related to conservation. In a better situation, we think maybe it could be baked into the Farm Bill baseline, so we have higher levels of funding for important programs. But there's just so much kind of negotiation that still lies ahead. There are steps where folks have to talk within their own committees and then within their own chambers, and then they of course have to get together in conference. So there's just so much negotiation ahead, and I think we're taking those dollars and kind of seeing where that is just really powerful.
I don't have much to add, other than, as a private land trust, and a private organization working with private landowners. One of the things that we tell, our partners, regardless of whether there's seems to be an abundance of funding or a lack of funding, is demonstrate what works. So we know that these conservation projects and programs work. And so when you can consistently show successes, and efficient, smart use of those funds, that is the best way to build the case for, those negotiations. And so that's our role and what we're trying to do in working with our partners in the Farm Bill.
So kind of building off of that, everyone here has, on the panel has talked about, your work with landowners, your work with producers. And I have kind of two parts of this question. One is, what are, in your experience, what are landowner attitudes toward conservation? What kinds of approaches, like you said, what works, what is most appealing to them, what kinds of structures are most appealing to them. And then, there's a lot of Iowa farmland that's rented. And so it's not just landowners, what are the dynamics between landowners and tenants? Like I said, I'm kind of involved in some of these dynamics in my own farm, but what are the dynamics between landowners, maybe absentee landowners, and then the people who are actually the tenants who are working on land?
I'll start since I still have my hand. Classic lawyer answer, it just depends, right? So it depends if, that landowner or the farmer owns the land, pointing to Ingrid's point about land tenure issues, but in our experience, it just takes time. And so a lot of our work is just relationship building. So a conservation easement where a landowner is coming to us enthusiastic about doing that conservation easement, usually still takes 4 to 6 months, and that's on the fast end of things. Oftentimes those relationships take years, even decades to develop. And so for us, it's about meeting those landowners, those producers, where they're at, helping them walk through their options, letting them come to a plan of action on their own terms, and then being there when they are ready to take those next steps.
It's a really helpful answer on that. And I would just add that there's this interesting dynamic of who's the landowner and who's the tenant. Sometimes the landowner is like, oh, I want to leave it for my grandkids, and the tenant's like, that's an extra step and more money. It's a different thing happening in their head, even if they still care. They certainly could be right there with you, but they're having different thought process about what it means to implement that conservation. Some key specifics that we've seen, I know in Nebraska, my organization works with women landowners and landowners in general, talking with them about how do you write some conservation components within a contract that you've got with your renter. So instead of just a handshake agreement or go for it every year, maybe you write in that they're going to do cover crops or no-till, and then maybe you're helping them financially with a percentage of that. Could there be a discussion between the two parties to make something beneficial there? So those are some thoughts I have. There's a different action being taken by each party.
Yeah. And I would say it's really about one of the big pieces is financial incentive. We have come out of a period of time, decades of the financial incentives have been really driven by production. Right? They haven't been driven by conservation. They haven't been driven by working lands where you're integrating the environmental benefits in the production itself. You have those things separated. So, I think that's a really big key. When it gets to the landowner and the tenant, or USDA speak of operator. So the operator, whether they're the owner operator or a renter, what's the incentive? When they're making a decision, how does that affect the financial year-to-year operation of the farm? And when you have a rental agreement, part of it is that those two can lay out all the costs and all the benefits, and then try to share those equally. And so if we're creating benefits for conservation, for ecosystem services, are those benefits that can be shared or at least articulated by both the landowner and the operator, so that that we can accelerate and grow those things. One example would be the cover crop incentive program developed in Iowa by PFI IDOLS. It was, you know, if you're putting cover crops on, and they called it a good driver premium discount, right? So if you're doing the cover crops, then you get a discount on your crop insurance. Well, we modeled that was developed here in Iowa, then out of COVID, this is some of those ad hoc things that we were able at USDA to say, hey, we're gonna take this nationally. So if you use cover crops, then we'll give you a premium incentive, you know, 5%, or $5 an acre. So those are some things. I think it's those incentives.
Great, thanks. And one other question, just to bring us all the way back around to biodiversity and biodiversity preservation. What would each of you say is the most critical step we can take to preserve biodiversity in the state?
Please.
We often don't think of Iowa as being a highly developed state, but in fact, Iowa is probably the most developed state. We have less than 0.1% of remnant prairie remaining, over 80% of our original wetlands have been drained. And so preserving what is left of natural habitat and protecting it permanently is step number one. And then step two, because so much has been converted, restoration and ecological restoration, I think is critical to making headway and doing so in planned corridors, like what I showed, being intentional about where we have the biggest and best impact.
Yeah, I think my answer is really hard to tie any policy solution to, but it's we need some sort of attitude and cultural shift. Again, because we have so many privately owned lands, we have to get folks that are engaged and excited to implement conservation in their operations, maybe throw it in a CRP or do something that is going to benefit their land but have that greater benefit as well. And just in our current system, we have that choir, we have those folks that are excited. And again, I love working with those people because they are who we need and that's the energy we need. But there's so many people, the ratio of folks that are in that group and then the folks that are not is very skewed and it can be very disappointing. So I would love to just somehow get that sort of cultural shift with our private landowners and get them excited.
And I would just go back to something I mentioned about you know, working with nature and that shift of bringing production and conservation, ecosystem services, environmental, integrating those things together. We're gonna have to have more diversity. And so how we create production systems that are rewarded for doing that, that's gonna be key. And I think we're starting down that road. I mean, 5 or 6 years ago, if you said, and I was actually in this space as when I was at the Drake Ag Law Center. And then I was also at Iowa Power and Light, and we were working with farmers directly on climate change. But if you talk to them individually, oh, they can talk about it. But if you talk about farmers talking about climate change, the consensus was they just won't talk about it. They're all climate deniers and they're not going to talk about it. And we kind of created and reinforced that dynamic. But the reality is when you get to them, when you talk to them about it and you provide them with an ability to drive the policy, to drive the outcome, and basically it was, can you reward farmers, can we identify a problem and reward farmers for solving it? They were ready and willing to do that, right? And so climate is really key. We're going to have to accelerate our natural systems. We got to accelerate the nutrient cycle, the water cycle, the carbon cycle. I mean, we got to use agriculture to do that. And so if we don't have incentives, and we don't have programs, and we don't have, you know, an environment where farmers are rewarded for doing that, but instead only rewarded for maximizing production, we're going to continue to maximize production, and we're not going to get the diversity we need. But when we start to integrate those things, farmers can actually do it. And I would argue farmers need to have a whole food system. The fastest point of change and the most cost-effective point of change is the farmer themselves. Most farms can pivot in about 5 years. And we've seen it over time, whether it's GMO technology, whether it's precision agriculture, whether it's those horses, the tractors, right? Farmers, when the incentive is there, can shift very fast. There's other parts of agriculture in that whole continuum that cannot shift that fast, right? So unleashing the power of farmers to shift into this new mindset, absolutely critical. And with that diversity, working lands like CRP, that prairie strips, you can drive through. Can't drive through CRP. Oh wait, no, you can now. Right? Oh, you can't grace CRP. Oh, well, actually we can now. We have some of those things. So that idea of integrating those things, again, I think is really key.
Yeah, and even just including prairie strips and CRP is relatively new, so yeah, yeah, and a lot of these farmer, I think you're absolutely right, you know, locally driven efforts that put producers in the driver's seat, and I think Kate, to your point, you know, I think it's important to, it's not only the percentage, it's not only getting to 30% of land preserved, but what land are we preserving, and is that being done? And Anna, you mentioned this too, is that being done conscientiously? Is that being done, you know, with particular critical species in mind, or critical habitats in mind, or critical ecosystems in mind? So with that, we are at time. I want to thank everyone on the panel for being here today. I think this was a great discussion. Oh, Anna.
Yeah, no, just again, make a plug for the Iowa Nature Summit, which will be held at Drake, the other law school. That'll be November 16th and 17th. So if you could spend all day talking about this stuff for 2 days, like I could, check that out. I know the Hubbles are also doing a scholarship program for students to cover registration costs. So I encourage you all to check that out and look into that if you're interested. Sorry, we can.
No, that's great. And one other plug, Kate and I are actually working on a white paper covering these same topics that we'll be publishing later this month. So I'm gonna keep an eye out for that. And with that, I want to thank you all for being here, and have a wonderful rest of your day.